Peace, propaganda, disinformation, all present at any negotiating table. Are the recent peace talks in Switzerland any different? Peace talks without a Russian presence, how will that work and is it meant to? What could go possibly wrong with this setup? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
Reality is described by language, and language can be used as a means for communication, but also as a dangerous tool. Few are as aware of this as Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who by using specific phrasing is the prime voice of Russian peace propaganda. The Kremlin has publicly declared its willingness to negotiate an end to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. This position, however, is only a strategic maneuver aimed at influencing international opinion and reducing support for Ukraine. In this manner, Russia is setting the stage for actual peace negotiations, which it wants to enter from a position of power. By engaging in false negotiations, Russia is trying to buy time to militarize the occupied Ukrainian territories and prepare for further offensives. Russian peace propaganda carried out by its government, diplomats and state media is based on three main points. First, peace is hampered by Ukraine's alleged reluctance to negotiate. Secondly, Western countries are prolonging the war by supporting Ukraine. And thirdly, the United States is controlling Ukraine to weaken Russia. This message portrays Russia as open to diplomacy, while at the same time justifying its actions as defensive. Russia's ceasefire proposals, such as the one following Ukraine's offensive in the autumn of 2022, are aimed at legitimizing its annexation and ensuring recognition of new territorial realities. Peace negotiations since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 have largely failed. Post-invasion talks in 2022 only led to agreements on humanitarian corridors and prisoner exchanges. The discovery of Russian war crimes in Bucha and Irpin halted further negotiations, and President Zelensky has declared that Ukraine will not negotiate as long as Putin is in power. Zelensky's peace plan, which included the restoration of territorial integrity and the withdrawal of Russian troops, gained international support, but was rejected by Russia. Despite Russia's propaganda efforts, Western societies have largely resisted, with some exceptions, increasing support for a peace agreement that justly punishes Russian aggression.
Well, I'm delighted to introduce our guest today, Professor Agnieszka Legucka, an analyst at the Eastern Europe programme at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Welcome once more to the programme.
Thank you for inviting me.
Great to have you. This idea of peace, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, it seemed that the radio waves were just full of John Lennon songs, kind of fairly mawkish sentimentality, but it seemed to drive a Western notion of peace, all happy together, you know, the lion lies down with the lamb, that sort of stuff. Is that just me being a cynic, or does that actually propel the Western diplomat in the way that he or she conducts negotiations?
I believe so, that the West has different understanding of winning and different understanding of peace, because it's very connected with the way how we negotiate with other partners. We negotiate in the common idea, common results, maybe not great for each part, but there can be a winning situation for both of sides, that win-win scenario. However, in Russia,
this is the game theory.
Yes, idea. Yes, a game theory, and in Russia there is no such a idea that both sides can win. So the same thing with the peace understanding, that if someone loses, then someone needs to win. And peace is seen not as an ideal element where you go, the final result. However, it's kind of in the middle results to be important, providing the victory. Like peace negotiations are only the way that can bring the final full winning for Russia.
Where did this idea come from of perpetual non-war, not war, not peace? Everything seems to be perpetual, some sort of conflict. As you said, peace is not a final destination, but a tool that you use. Where did that idea actually originate, or when?
I mean, from my research, the most visible were the 20s of 20th century. At the end of the 20s, Russian Bolsheviks and Soviet Union, in that time, it was trying to push the agenda that Soviet Union is a very peaceful actor. And at the same time, it was the moment for them to prepare the war, for example, against Poland, right? So there was a Litvinov protocol, for example, that was like forbidden the war in creating or like resolving international problems. They were saying that the war is bad, so let's go in the very peaceful environment. And we, as a Soviet Union, was very peaceful. And after the Second World War, in the Cold War, actually Russia, as Soviet Union, was fighting for peace all over. It's exactly how they perceive it. On one hand, they are trying to picture themselves as a good actor, as a peaceful actor. At the same time, it's preparing for war. Either is able to push the agenda that other things that does not work, for example.
And the idea of these peace negotiations is a very Orwellian use of language, is it? As you say, fighting for peace, war for peace, peace for war.
Militarization of negotiations, militarization of peace idea. Yeah, that's true.
So, why did it originate then, and what was the tradition behind it? Was there any previous tradition of this manipulation of language, using language as a propaganda tool, disinformation tool?
I think that the idea, maybe it can be even longer, because it is kind of imagine of Russia, right? Imagination of Russia for others. So picturing Russia as a very peaceful, as a very sometimes liberal country in previous century, but inside there was a totally different things, right? So it's showing the facade, but not showing what is behind. And what is behind was like very geopolitical rivalry, interest, maneuver machine, sometimes totalitarian one. But outside and in the propaganda also towards Russian citizens, there is an image that Russia did not attack any country, the false idea and the reality was the different thing. So that kind of peace propaganda is working abroad, definitely, in some areas, but also showing the authorities of Russia as a great or leaders who are only working for prestige of Russia all over.
It seems to rely on Western gullibility and naivety to believe this very sophisticated propaganda machine working on fertile ground in the West, the intellectual elite in the West in the 1920s and 30s. Has that gone, or is that still there? Are the Western elites still receptive to this sort of vision of Russia?
In some circles, yes. Unfortunately, I think that those countries which experience not the theory but reality of Russia are quite aware that one thing is said, but another thing is done by Russian authorities or even Soviet authorities before. But in the West, or even further, not only in the West but the so-called global South, there is an imagination of Russia as a better actor, as a rival towards the West. And in that component, it is shown, Russia is showing itself as a peaceful country regarding, for example, the US or colonial countries from Europe. And in that picture, Russia is one of the superpower which is using all the tools elsewhere or in its neighbor. And it's working, unfortunately, in many countries, in many societies, that if the peace is so nice, why don't we have peace in Ukraine, for example?
Yes. Why? So in going on that logic, the Russian logic, why did they not attend the so-called peace negotiations, the recent ones in Switzerland?
I believe that's the wise...
They saw themselves as this peaceful power, this peace-engendering power, and yet they didn't turn up.
Actually, it was, from my perspective, the decision of Ukraine not to invite Russia. But the aim of this Switzerland peace formula was for like breaking this Russian narrative that Ukraine doesn't want peace, because this is also element of we want peace, they don't want peace. And that's why Zelensky wanted to build a platform for other countries, including African countries from Asia too, or South Africa, for example, but also to show to Russian authorities the counter-narrative about the situation in Ukraine. And Russia itself, at the day before, Putin finally said something about the conditions that they can withdraw their forces only, and showing again its peaceful intention. However, those peaceful intentions were only to break this narrative from Ukraine, that Ukraine is searching for peace in Ukraine, in these occupied territories. However, Russia is just trying to drop a message that will like destroy this peaceful image of Zelensky.
So both sides, in a sense, are playing this in a very cynical way.
I think that those elements, what the Ukrainians doing, they have very strict plan. You have 10 points, which was made by Zelensky office, but in case of Russia, you don't have such a plan. You don't have clear message from Russia what actually is the aim of this war, what actually should be the results. It's only like changing the narrative about it, because they, at the beginning, we remember December 21, they had an ultimatum, Ukraine now in NATO for withdrawing NATO infrastructure from Central Europe, but then they were escalating their questions or requests to the West. For example, the nuclearization, demilitarization, and also Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia, he has the idea that Ukraine should abandon all the sovereignty and be dependent on Russia, to pay Russia for the war destruction in its territory. So you don't have a clear understanding exactly what Russia is putting on the table, because it's also from the Soviet time how they were negotiating. They were negotiating very high, and then making this chantage all over, and then waiting for some kind of offer from the West.
They seem to be using the from my recent reading about the Korean War and the Vietnam War, they used this tactic in Geneva in the 1950s and 1970s to escalate and then de-escalate. So if the West knows their tactics, how can they counter them? Or are they just very difficult to counter?
Yeah, you can show it all over. I mean, even we are complaining about the West approach to that ideas, especially in the United States. There are people who don't care about this conflict and let's have a peace and get rid of the topic, right? Because there is a fatigue of war. But many also capitals in Europe, and also administration in US, Biden administration, is knowing how Russia operates. So the key is to also not only know, but also make the strategic communication with our societies, how it works and why Russia is saying that. And I think the strategic communication needs to be also imposed to the regions which are not following directly, very closely this conflict, and showing that this war is a colonial war. So Russia is using all the instruments regarding like military, but also propaganda to win the war.
Are peace negotiations just war by other means? I mean, for example, the negotiations in the final stages of the Second World War, Eastern Europe was thrown under a bus. Yeah. And it was called peace.
Yeah, and the final thing, that Putin would like to start negotiations, for example, with American president, because that is the tool to break the willing of fight to Ukrainians. So they would start very happy, but would be in start, but then they will prolonging the negotiation, maximizing their ideas, what Ukraine should do, and then only that will be the tool to break actually Ukraine and our support to it.
And warfare has shown us that in the year when peace negotiations, if we can call them that, are taking place, that's when the fighting gets to be more intensive than in previous years. 1954, the French Dien Bien Phu. During the course of the battle, there were peace negotiations. In Korea, in Pyongyang, there were 2 years had to be said. So this was another tool during an armed conflict to use to leverage each other.
Yeah.
Rather than peace.
I mean, they were also operating in Syria, for example, just before the elections on Trump in the US. They were like bombing Aleppo so heavily just to put it on the table with negotiations with United States, exactly on the sphere of influence and that kind of topic, that kind of elements, because we can observe already in Ukraine they are trying to capture Kharkiv just to put it on the table with negotiations. Hopefully, and for us, fortunate, they failed with it, but still they want to have military posture to threaten us with, for example, nuclear power or like another third world war.
Final question as we draw to an end. The Vice President Kamala Harris said to impose about the negotiations, she was committed, the US, to continuing to impose costs on Russia, and we continue to work towards a just and lasting peace. I mean, these are kind of hollow words, but I suppose a diplomat has to say them.
Yes, and I saw the element of evolution regarding the European Union societies. They were at the beginning in the majority for just peace, meaning that let's have a peace and stop the war. But now the reality and how Russia is operating on the occupied territories, societies in Europe finally decided to support Ukraine, not only just peace in the sense that to have negotiations, but actually withdrawing Russian troops from Ukraine, because that would be the final peace for us.
Professor Legutska, thank you very, very much for coming onto the program.
Thank you very much, but that was a real pleasure.
So that's all we have time for today. Please join me, Jan Darash, for How We Got Here.